Hello, I'm just going to do an audio walkthrough of the entirety of the paper project. So there's a lot of resources on Blackboard, including grading rubrics, examples of APA format, examples of APA style. Each one of the assignments includes fairly thorough instructions, but I'm wanting to kind of give you guys a big picture and maybe address or help answer some of the questions you may have had. So broadly speaking, this covers the remainder of the semester, and this is a sequential process. So the IV and DV worksheet is due March 30th, and that's already been posted onto Blackboard under the lab. And what I'm wanting you to do with that is take a look and answer those questions as honestly as possible. And what you're really wanting to think about is what psychological constructs are you interested in? And you need two of them. You need a causal agent, an IV, and you need an outcome, a DV. And that IV needs to be something that can be categorized into three levels. So, for example, low, medium, or high of a psychological construct like anxiety. It could be experimental conditions. So, no memory aid, 5 minutes of education on memory, 20 minutes of education on memory. So you're wanting to think about basically having three levels. A lot of times the first level is going to be either no intervention or a very low level of the construct you're interested in. The second level is going to be a moderate level or some form of medium intervention. And then the last level should be a high level. So a high level of the construct or a fairly intensive intervention. So you're wanting to think about what are you interested in. And interventions could include various types of training, various types of therapies to help people with their lives. So again, you might, for example, look at no therapy versus a moderate level of cognitive behavioral therapy over a 2-week period versus intensive cognitive behavioral therapy over a 4-month period. You might be interested in athleticism and its influences on motivation. So athleticism, for instance, you might basically categorize it into three levels. Again, you could have no interest in being athletic, mild cardiovascular exercise every week, or intensive exercise. And then your DV. So what is the outcome that you're interested in? And this outcome, again, will generally be some form of psychological construct or performance. So it can be performance in school, it can be understanding of reading, it can be psychological well-being, job satisfaction. There's a lot of different options there. But you're definitely wanting to pick a couple of things that you're interested in that if you could run a study on. Those are due March 30th, and feedback on Blackboard will be due by April 2nd. So that means that when you load up your IV to DV worksheet on Blackboard and submit it by the 30th, by the 2nd you'll be able to go back and get any feedback. You're going to definitely want to look at that feedback because that feedback is going to be very directive on what you should be doing moving forward. The next part of this project is the bibliography 1. You're needing to find at least 4 references that are basically about your IV. So you're wanting to find references that are empirical, and the assignment kind of goes over what that is, and take a look and find them and summarize them. This is going to really help you when it comes down to finally starting to write that introduction section. This is due April 6th, and again, you'll get feedback by April 9th, and this feedback really is going to help you understand what you did well, what you did poorly, and how to use these references to write that result or that introduction section. Bibliography 2 is due April 13th, and again, you'll get feedback a few days later by April 16th, and this is primarily for 4 or more references around your DV. Now, briefly, let me just remind you and make the statement that your bibliography 1 can include studies that address both your IV and your DV, and likewise, bibliography 2 can have articles that reference both your IV and DV constructs. This is just a way to kind of conceptualize that you need at least 4 that are looking at your IV and at least 4 that are looking at your DV. Ideally, you'll want to find 8 articles that reference both. And again, it's due on the 13th. Now, a week later is when your first section of your actual paper is due. Title page, introduction, and references, and I'll go into this fairly in detail in a few slides. It's due the 20th, and again, you'll get feedback by the 24th. Now, that feedback is going to be mainly just the grading at that point. This is the one time you're submitting this section. You're not going to be submitting a final paper. As you write this paper, you're simply going to be adding sections. Shortly after you turn that paper in, you will be getting SPSS readouts from me. So you're not actually going to collect data on this study. You are going to be given a generic set of results that you'll be using to write your results section. Section 2, which is the methods and results, are due on April 27th, and again, you'll get feedback and grading. And finally, the last section is you're going to add the abstract and discussion. And again, that's due May 4th. Final reminder, when you turn in Section 2, it should contain Section 1, and when you turn in Section 3, it should contain Section 1 and 2. So when you turn in the last section, you will be turning in a final paper, even though all we'll be grading is the abstract and discussion. So just a reminder, on Blackboard there is a lot of resources, and unfortunately we are now a 100% online class, which means that there's a fair amount of work that you need to do that isn't necessarily going to be happening at a set time in lab. So for example, in a regular in-person class, we'd probably be going over some of these materials in lab in real time with you being able to ask questions. Here you can still ask questions, but it's up to you to find the time and when you want to go and take a look at all these materials and see if you have questions, and if so, reach out to your TA or to me. So again, if you go to the coursework section of Blackboard, you're going to find that there is a whole section on paper project. If you click on that, you're going to find the project information, the grading rubrics, sample papers. That's not a sample paper for this class, but it's a sample paper of how to write an APA 7th edition sample paper, which is what we're grading on. There's also a section on how to do 7th edition citations and references, and then all of the actual assignment due dates are in there as well. So when you're needing to submit your IVDV worksheet, your references 1, your references 2, your section 1, that's where you're going to go to find those submission portals. So just briefly, let's go over the IV and DV worksheet again is the first thing due. And again, all you're wanting to ask is, what is your initial idea? What are your IVs? And again, we kind of already talked about this, but make sure your IV is something that you can group into 3 conditions, 3 levels. What is your additional idea of how these levels are going to be? So how are you going to be thinking about this variable? So what is your independent variable? And how are you going to split it into 3 levels? And then finally, what is going to be your DV? Your first bibliography, which is due a week later, again, you're wanting to look for empirical research articles, and again, the actual assignment shows a very good example. It has a graphic of how to know if you have an empirical research article. They should not be review articles. They should be actual research studies that have looked at empirical data. So you're looking for studies that have a method section. You're looking for studies that tell you who their sample was. So they should be looking at a sample. And you're basically making sure that then as you write up this article, a 1 to 2 page summary of the article, that you're also using your own words. So do not copy and paste directly from the article. Do not use direct quotes. I want this to be in your words because it's easier to do it that way to make sure that you're not accidentally plagiarizing the article. So each one of these detailed reviews, and by detailed, I'm not wanting you to go into an entire paper. I'm wanting 1 or 2 pages double spaced. Now there's a fair amount to cover, but a lot of what you're covering can easily be done in a couple sentences. So what was the purpose of the study? What was their primary hypothesis? And what was their reasoning behind that hypothesis? Who was in their studies? Generally, what did they use? And each, again, so participants can be a sentence or 2. Kind of think about that you're basically writing a slightly more detailed abstract for the study that you're interested in and that you're reviewing. What were their procedures? And again, you're not rewriting the whole procedure section. This can be a few sentences as well. What were their results? And again, a lot of these papers are going to have a long results section. You're mainly just wanting to summarize the main points. Also, think about what are you interested in. So if this article does cover your independent variable and your dependent variable, but it also covers other things, you don't necessarily need to spend a lot of time talking about those other variables they looked at. You're reading this article to see what does it tell you about what you're interested in. And finally, was their hypothesis supported or not? And if it was supported, what is the implication specifically to the question that you want to ask? So that's what you're really trying to accomplish in these summaries. So you're going to do 4 of them, 4 articles, over the next week before they're due on April 6th. And again, for this first one, mainly focus on your IV, though again, if you can find articles that cover both your IV and DV, all the better. Bibliography 2, due the 13th, is pretty much the exact same assignment, another 4 articles. summarizing, and again, mainly focused on your DV, but ideally, if you can find articles that cover both, that's even better. So then we're going to get into your actual title page, introduction and references, section 1. So section 1 does need to have an APA title page, it needs to have an introduction, and it needs to have an APA style reference section. This is due April 20th. Now, you're going to be able to draw greatly from those bibliographies. So you now have 8 articles that you have fully summarized. You're not going to cut and paste those into the introduction, but you can use sections of them, so you can basically take chunks that you've written and reuse them. That's fine. There's sometimes the worry of what's called self-plagiarism, but that is specifically when you're publishing something, it's out there as a published source, and then you copy and paste from yourself to get a second published source. As the first 2 parts of this assignment really are just to help you gather information and get an understanding of the research studies that you're building off of, it is fine to use your own information that you did in the first 2 assignments on this section 1 assignment. However, I don't want you to just take all 8 summaries and smack them together. I do want you to write an introduction, and let's talk about what an introduction is. One thing, APA style, you should never be mentioning IVs or DVs. We should be only talking about the construct level. Your introduction should start broad. It should discuss, generally speaking, what you're interested in with no mention of IVs, DVs, or operations. So you're going to basically let people know what you're interested in and what you're wanting to study, and then you're going to kind of do a little bit of a roadmap of what the introduction is going to cover. The next section is going to be a section that kind of defines what is your independent variable and what has been found about it in the past. In other words, summarizing past research. Now, those summaries should not be exhaustive. They had this hypothesis, they used this methodology, they found these results. You're wanting to summarize it down into the main points at this point. And that's, again, I want to stress why we're not just cutting and pasting those bibliographies, but we're using those bibliographies as a guide to help us write this section. Your next section is going to be on your DV construct, so what are you actually interested in your dependent variable, what's been found in previous research. And then finally, you're going to have a section that basically brings them together. So looking at how the IV and DV are related to each other in past studies, and this is going to lead you to a conclusion, which then results in a hypothesis. How do you expect these 2 constructs to be related? Be very specific. So I expect higher levels of the IV will result in lower levels of the DV. What is that relationship that you're hypothesizing? Each of these will be a section in one large introduction. I would say that the broad discussion, so that first part, should be about 1 or 2 paragraphs, maybe a half page to a page. The section on your IV construct is going to cover, at minimum, 3 to 4 articles, and it should probably be about 2 to 3 pages double-spaced. Your DV construct should also be about 2 to 3 pages double-spaced. And finally, drawing it all together is probably a page or 2, your conclusion, a paragraph, your hypothesis, a couple of sentences. And again, make sure that those reference sections are in APA style. As I said, on April 22nd, I will post a generic set of SPSS outputs. They'll have sample and demographic information, and they will also have a statistical analysis of a generic 3-level IV. So it will literally say on the output, level 1, level 2, level 3. Assuming that you've created an IV where level 1 is a low level of your construct, level 2 is a medium level of your construct, level 3 is a high level of your construct. And it will then be examined on its effects of a generic DV. And it will literally say generic DV. So when you're running your analysis, you're not running it, you're going to be interpreting these outputs. You'll basically paste in mentally, and when you write it, definitely within the paper, the actual levels of your IV and the actual name of your DV. And this will allow you to write your results section. Your methods and results are due April 21st. Again, the method section is how did you bring the constructs to life in your study? In other words, how you operationalize them. And this should be as if you were doing this study. So there's generally 3 major sections of a method section. The first one is participants. So who were the participants? How did you get them? And describe the demographics. And that will be provided to you in that SPSS output. You're then going to talk about the materials. Now, this is completely on you. How did you define your IV, and how did you experimentally manipulate it or measure it? You're going to need to write this out. So what was the IV, and how would you have manipulated it if you were actually running the study? Also, what was your outcome? What was the DV, and how was it measured, and how was that information gathered? You may need references here. For example, if your DV is an established scale of self-esteem, you need to tell me where you got that from and describe that measure. Then you're going to just basically write the procedures at the end, and that's exactly what happened to each participant as they went through the study. How did you get them? So how did you get them into your study? What were they told about the study? How were they assigned to IV conditions or levels? What happened once they were exposed to them? So were these trainings? Was this a measurement? What was your IV, and how did they experience it? How did they fill out your DV? So how did you get your outcome? And then finally, how did they complete the study? Was it an online, in person, through mail, etc.? The results section, also a part of the methods and results section 2. You're going to restate your hypothesis, remind people what you're testing for. You're going to state the statistic you used. In this case, you're using a one-way ANOVA. You're going to state what the IV was and what were the 3 levels and what your DV was. You're then going to actually provide the ANOVA information, and we'll be going over this both in lecture and lab before you have to write this section when we discuss the ANOVA. We're then going to state whether or not we found statistical significance, and if we did find significance, did it support our hypothesis, and what was the effect size. And again, we haven't talked about it yet, but we will then discuss the post hoc tests that are necessary to find out exactly what the difference was. So we finally end that method section with what was the actual results, basically in English, providing means and standard deviation. So what was the mean and standard deviation of your DV at each level of your IV? The final section is just putting the rest of the paper together. You're going to add the abstract, and I've pretty much listed it here by sentences what the abstract needs, and then you're going to put the discussion section in. The discussion section should probably be 2 to 3 pages. You're going to summarize your hypothesis again in English, talk about your constructs, not your IVs and DVs, and what your findings were. You're not going to be listing means and standard deviations. You're not going to be listing statistical information. You're just going to be putting it into English. Then you're going to tie back to your previous literature. So what did your lit review, what did that introduction say about what your constructs are and how are they related, and how did your findings either support or provide new information about these findings? You're going to talk about the limitations. So all studies have limitations, and we've been covering that both in this class and the previous class. So if you're focused on causation, you tend to lose generalizability. If you're focused on generalizability, you often tend to lose internal validity or causation. So what were the limitations in your particular study? Were there any confounds? Were there any issues? What could have been done better? And you can also draw from your literature review here as well. What have past studies found as far as problems researching this particular set of constructs? From those limitations, you're going to write a future research section. You're basically going to give suggestions. How would you do it better? And finally, you're going to have a summary of the main findings, the major implications, and this is going to be basically one paragraph. You're going to end strong. Here's what I found, and here's why it matters.